a long time, the advent of Islam was more than often seen by many as the ushering in of a new age. Even from the traditional Muslim perspective, the newly established monotheistic community of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, made a swift break with all that came before it. Considering the pre-Islamic times as nothing more than the days of total ignorance and barbarity, a total opposite of the world created anew, which fell in line with the Quranic vision for humanity. In this installment of Real Talk with Terron Poole, we are going to discuss the religions, traditions, and movements that prevailed in the time period and milieu in which the Quran originated and contemporaneous to the very early days of Islam. To help navigate through what seems like a lot of ground to cover, I'm pleased to welcome Guy Stroumsa to my platform in order to discuss what I believe will be a very informative conversation. Thank you for joining me today, Guy.
Pleasure.
All right, and for those unaware of your scholarship and achievements, if you don't mind, I'm going to mention that Guy Stroumsa is the Martin Buber Professor Emeritus of Comparative Religions at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, the Professor Emeritus of the Study of Abrahamic Religions at the University of Oxford here in England, where you were the first professor of the study of the Abrahamic religions. Your research focuses on the dynamics of encounters between religious traditions and institutions in the Roman Empire and in late antiquity, in the Mediterranean and in the Middle East. You have studied the crystallization of the Abrahamic traditions in late antiquity as a background to Islam. You see Gnosticism, Manichaeism, and early Christianity as a unique laboratory for understanding religious transformation in late antiquity. Your doctoral dissertation was the study and development of Gnostic mythology and demonstrated its roots in Judaism and biblical interpretations. You have studied to seek the cross-traditional interdisciplinary boundaries in order to study religious phenomena from a comparative perspective. This approach permits you, as well as many other people, to understand the mechanisms behind the religious revolution of late antiquity, which will be the time period we'll be discussing today. And really, we could spend the whole discussion going over your resume alone, from your time at the many universities you've studied at and worked for, that I've mentioned, not only acting as a lecturer, professor, but also where you were the chair, head, organizer, or director of numerous departments, programs, research committees, and study groups. You have 18 books published, 3 alone published in 2021, which is really impressive. One which will be somewhat more of the focus of this conversation, with many more forthcoming this year. And you're not, if they're not out already, the ones that are supposed to come out this year, it's towards the end of 2022. But you have 21 books edited under your name with over 150 articles. So my first question, Guy, Professor Stroumsa, what is it that motivated you to go in the direction of comparative religious studies pertaining to the Mediterranean, the Near Eastern cultures during late antiquity?
Well, before I answer, I'm not sure I'll be able to answer this question, but I want to thank you, Terron, for inviting me in a in a in a podcast around Islamicists, and I want to make clear at the start that I'm no Islamicist. My Arabic is less than mediocre, but I'm married to an Islamicist and an Arabist, and through her I pick up a few things. But what I'll do today with you, if I understand correctly, is to speak about the religious background of late antiquity within which Islam was born, within which the Prophet Muhammad appeared in the early 7th century. So that's what we're going to do. So I'm not going to speak about Islam itself. You ask me, what is it that made me decide to invest my time and little energy I have in the study of religion? Well, I think that religion is one of the most important and universal phenomena throughout world history. And I was curious to see how my own religious background relates to other things. I decided to move to Israel when I was a young man, was born in France, in Paris, and obviously I studied in Jerusalem. Obviously, this is a city that Judaism was not born in Jerusalem, Islam probably not, but certainly Christianity was born in this city. And so I decided, for a number of reasons, my knowledge of languages, the lack thereof, to focus on the history of early Christianity. That's how, and you mentioned my doctoral thesis at Harvard on Gnosticism, which is maybe the first major Christian heresy. I'm myself more of a heretic than an Orthodox person, so I've been interested in how heresies are born and how the mechanisms of religious transformation function. And so I cannot deal with everything. I can deal only with texts which I can read more or less in the original tongue, as a scholar. But I hope that some of my work, my intuitions, may be applicable, mutatis mutandis, to other fields, such as the evolution of Hinduism or the birth of Buddhism or what have you. So that's what I'm myself. I've been working most of my life on late antiquity, which I define broadly as the centuries between Jesus and Muhammad, if you want. But I'm not only a historian, I'm a historian of religion or of religions, and a historian of the discipline itself. In order to understand how a discipline works, certainly in the humanities, you have to understand its origins and how it evolved and the kind of questions are being asked and so on. Certainly in religion, where things are so delicate and so personal. So that's what I've been doing. I'm sure I've not answered your question, but we could go on, and that's not what we want to talk about. But some things everyone hides in the depth of oneself, but I'm very interested in how religions function and transform themselves in history.
And I definitely agree. Some cards you have to keep close to your chest and just reveal what is necessary at times. But I believe you answered my question perfectly. But still, what continues to motivate you to continue researching and writing? As I mentioned, you still have many more articles and publications that are forthcoming. Late antiquity, even though from my perspective as a layman, if you would call me that, it seems like such a wide area of study. But for somebody from your perspective, do you ever feel like you've said enough, or how do you still find gems to uncover? And even from reading your book, The Making of Abrahamic Religions in Late Antiquity, and also some of your articles on your academia edu page, or the ones that you've shared with me, I still notice that you continue to evolve your work, where the articles you may have written a couple decades ago, the ones that you put in your upcoming books, they might have the same flavor, but I noticed that you may have evolved some of your thinking or thoughts past what they were in your previous publications. So if I could sum it up, how do you get the motivation to continue your work and uncover gems in your work?
The short answer, Terron, is that it keeps me off the streets. I mean, that's what I do. I don't need it for a living anymore, but that's what I do, and I'm curious, and I always want to learn new things. There are different kinds of scholars. There are different kinds of people and different kinds of scholars. One kind is those who dug deeper and deeper the same hole in order to reach the core of the universe. I don't know. Others, and I think I belong more to these people, are those who test the grounds in many places. You want to describe more or less the circumference of a phenomenon. Let me put it that way. If you want to study an iceberg, you can put a sound and try to understand how deep it goes, or you can, on a small aircraft, turn around the iceberg and take a number of pictures. And both are right, but you can't do both at the same time. And different people prefer to plunge, and different people prefer to survey. I belong to these. I know the price. The price is that you're never the most serious person in the field. But on the other hand, you don't get bored.
Definitely.
So there is a give and take.
And just not so we move too sideways, but that's really the nature of my channel, is to uncover what was going on, not only at the time Islam came or originated in history, but what was going on around it and what was going on before it, because I believe those things are just as important as the phenomena itself, which in its own right are phenomenons within each other. And as I mentioned, a part of your CV, you were the first professor of the study of the Abrahamic religions at Oxford University, a chair created only in the year 2008. So my question is, what does such a position entail, and why did its creation take so long, given the fact that Christianity, Judaism, as well as Islam had been studied academically for at least several centuries prior in Europe?
This is an excellent question. I think I have elements of an answer because I've been thinking about that for a long time. Look, I taught for 31 years at the Hebrew University, and I taught comparative religion with a special emphasis on early Christianity, Christian mysticism. Many colleagues were doing Judaism and Islam, and I was with a smaller number of people working on Christianity. At some point, a friend of mine from Oxford asked me whether I was interested in applying for a new chair. And at first I said, no, thank you. My wife has just been elected rector of the university and I can't. And then he insisted and I decided to apply. And once I was chosen, I thought I wanted to take the challenge. The challenge was the following. I'd been teaching religion for 31 years, and the year I was asked to apply to the Oxford position was the first year I had decided to give an introduction to Judaism, Christianity, and Islam together. And I didn't call them the Abrahamic religions, but it was the same idea. And I thought my thought and my experience has evolved enough for me to try to tackle this huge challenge. I had, now, the question is, your other question is, why was not this chair established earlier? I was a fellow at Lady Margaret Hall on Norham Gardens. And when I walked every day back to my college from the center of the city, from the university, I remembered that a great scholar of religion, Max Müller, had lived on the same street 150 years before me. Max Müller was a Sanskritist, and he taught Hinduism and comparative mythology. He was also a Christian, but he didn't teach Islam and Judaism and Christianity, really. But he was a good friend of Ernest Renan, the French scholar who, under the influence of Max Müller, decided on the other side of the channel to tackle the idea of studying religions in a comparative way. And he wanted to do with Judaism, Christianity, and Islam what Max Müller had been doing for Indology and Buddhist studies. And I kept asking myself, why didn't this happen? I mean, there were people, Renan as well as a number of other great scholars in the mid-19th century, knew, of course, Greek and Latin, because everybody had been taught Greek and Latin in school. And he also knew very well Hebrew and relatively well Arabic and Syriac. So he was in possession of the tools, of the essential tools in order to work comparatively. He had been trained for the priesthood, for the Catholic priesthood, and at some point decided there was a crisis, an intellectual and faith crisis. He realized that the Catholic school was unable to deal with the history of the Bible, even biblical criticism, and he left the church.
Can I ask a question just at that point right there? Were they unable to deal with higher criticism, or were at that time they just didn't want to deal with it, period?
No, I think that was the time when liberal Protestant theologians in Germany, mainly in Germany, were developing high criticism of the Hebrew Bible and of the New Testament. The Catholics didn't want to touch that. That was prohibited, and it remained prohibited for a long time. But Renan, who knew German very well, was reading the German scholars and wanted to do something similar. Now, his thesis was on Ibn Rushd, on Averroes, the major philosopher from Al-Andalus. So he knew Arabic and he was interested in Islamic texts. But for him, and that's the point I want to get now, but for him, as for most European scholars at the time, let me put it that way, because he was a friend of Max Müller, and Max Müller developed his comparative mythology through the idea of the similarity of Indo-European languages, or European and Aryan languages. Sanskrit is indeed similar in its structure and grammar to Greek, Latin, and most other European languages. And so there was this idea of Indo-European linguistics, which is true to this day, of course. And from Indo-European linguistics, they thought there might be Indo-European peoples. And if there are Indo-European peoples, there may be also Indo-European mythologies and religions. And that was a deep mistake. There's no such thing. But one can understand how the mistake was made. It was not made malevolently or viciously. It was made because scholarship had reached that stage of the point. And so scholars started to think about Europe and India, Europe and Iran, ancient Iran, and the Near East, the Near East of the Semitic languages, Hebrew, Arabic, Aramaic, Syriac, Ge'ez, etc., was being dropped. If you want, there was a huge bridge between Europe and Europe in the 19th century. Europeans thought they were the acme of human history. Of course, that was the time of colonialism and imperialism, of course. So between Europe and the ancient Aryans, there is a family relationship, which is not shared by the Semites. It's not shared by the Semitic languages, and therefore it's not shared by the Semitic peoples. And therefore, Jews and Arabs became less respected, and in many cases despised, actually. Now, the roots of European and Christian anti-Semitism are much more complex than the 19th century, but scholars added their own brick to the wall, if you want, of anti-Semitism and anti-Arabism, which was more or less identical to anti-Islam. I'm making a long story very short, but this in order to say that the study of Islam and of Judaism fell outside the interests, the personal interests of a European scholar.
Yeah, I got the feeling from reading chapter 5 of your book, The Myth of Semitic Monotheism, that you place a considerable amount of blame on Ernest Renan and maybe some of his other contemporaries for why the Abrahamic religions maybe stagnated as far as the study of the three in a familiar sense. And I had read that a lot of it had to do with the discovery of Sanskrit sharing the same, was it grammar, phonology as European languages, which turned the idea towards that past the Near East over to maybe the Iran Indian region. But I do have a question. What was the study of the three religions like before Ernest Renan? Was there a shift where did you see a period where the prospect of the three being studied in a familial sense before Renan happening? It was a time of Orientalist art. I know some people have negative opinions about Orientalist art, but it does seem like Europeans were more curious, more open to studying the East. And but it seems like you mentioned that Ernest Renan, his contemporaries, due to the foundings of Sanskrit, that had kind of stagnated it. So I guess my question is, what was the study of the three religions like before Ernest Renan? And then after, what was it like until the establishment of the chair in 2008 of your position?
Okay. Again, to make a very long story extremely short, before the mid-19th century, there was very little scholarly study of religions. There was much study of religion, but that was almost always theological and therefore polemical.
Mm,
Since most scholars were European Christians, they were polemical vis-à-vis all other religions, including Judaism, Islam, and Buddhism, and so on. There was, before Renan, there was a kind of scholars as Christians knew that there were monotheistic religions and polytheistic religions. Islam and Judaism, while they were not the true religion, were monotheistic.
mm,
And therefore, there was a sense of family relationship between Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. That was broken in the mid-19th century because of the bridge with the Indo-European, the discovery that we Europeans, and we are Christians, are Europeans and Indo-Europeans, and therefore, although Jesus may have been a Jew, there is very little connection, intellectual connection between Judaism and Christianity, and certainly between Islam and Christianity. So Islam and Arabic and Judaism and Hebrew is a bit different because it's important for Christian theology because of the language of the Old Testament. But certainly Arabic and Islam became a part of what became called as Oriental studies or Orientalism. We know that in the last two generations, since Edward Said's certainly book on Orientalism, it became muddled together with imperialism and colonialism. And therefore, the study of the Oriental languages, peoples, religions, and so on, and literatures became a field for scholars who had invested much effort in learning the languages and getting the manuscripts, and there was no photocopying machine at the time, and certainly no email and internet. So it was very hard, but they managed and they started editing books and so on. Some of these scholars were certainly very impressive, Renan, but they had often, not always, they had a low opinion of the religions they were studying. Now what happened in the and therefore Christianity is utterly different from Judaism and Islam. Judaism and Islam will be studied in Oriental studies, and Judaism also in theological faculties, but only the Bible. What becomes later Judaism is ignored completely. And Christianity is studied in theological faculties, and therefore there is very little relationship. Now, what happened in 2008? I'll tell you a story. I applied to the position, I got it, I came to Oxford, and eventually I met what Oxford called the generous benefactor, the person who had given the money to establish this professorship. This person was a Saudi gentleman from Jeddah, so a good Muslim, obviously, and also rich. He made his money in oil business, like you and me, of course. And he decided to establish at Oxford a chair that would prove to the Europeans and to the world, because Oxford for him was the hub of the universe, would prove that Islam belongs to the family of the good religions, that Islam is in a way a European religion. I mean, that became clear to me during our first discussion. And he asked me, and tell me, Professor, how do you intend to fight Islamophobia in Europe? And of course, I had not prepared myself for this. I'm certainly, I don't have to say that I don't like Islamophobia, that I'm certainly willing to fight Islamophobia, but I don't know how to do that with my own intellectual tools. So I said, well, give me 5 years. And after 4 years, I resigned my chair because I realized that I had not succeeded. So that was, this is, and today I think there are a number of such professorships, and it's to show to Europeans or to Americans that Judaism and Islam are part of the family, in a sense.
It seems like a lot of scholarship is going that direction anyway, with the search for the origins of Islam, if you will. I know some people have certain reservations about the origins terminology, but it seems like placing Islam in late antiquity has done a lot with at least bridging the gap a bit. So the time period in history under discussion is late antiquity, which is in connection to the area of geography known as the Near East. I was surprised to find that the designation we call late antiquity as a period of study is fairly recent, since only the early 70s, starting with Peter Brown. But for those in our audience who might not be too familiar with this period, what are its precise chronological boundaries, and what made the later period of antiquity so unique in and of itself, apart from the other periods of antiquity, aside from it being of a later date?
This is wonderful that you ask this question after what we just said, because it's precisely since Peter Brown, in the last 50 years then, that what was called previously the decline and fall of the Roman Empire, since Gibbon, became a period in which not only you see the decline of antiquity, but you see the emergence of a new world, which will become the world of the Middle Ages, both Christian and Islamic, both Latin Christian, Greek Christian, or Byzantine and Arabic Islamic in the Middle East. You see this coming. Now, you ask about the precise boundaries. There are no precise boundaries. Different people define late antiquity in different ways. To be precise, late antiquity does not start before Constantine becomes a Christian. So it's in the 4th century. You have a world in which you have Christians and pagans and Jews and others, if you want. So this is, but you have Christians and Jews already in the 1st and 2nd century, and Christians certainly. And so late antiquity can be defined as long. Some scholars go very far and speak about the 1st millennium. I don't follow, until Avicenna, if you want. That's a bit stretching it, I think. But I think that certainly until the Abbasid revolution, you have in the Arabic-speaking Middle East, or the Middle East run by Arabic-speaking people, not everybody speaks Arabic, but you have then the 1st Islamic century is very much also a Byzantine century. The administration, the money, the patterns of thought, everything in many ways is still late ancient. So, and we now, most scholars recognize that you have late antiquity is when you have pagans plus Christians plus Jews plus others, and eventually plus Muslims. So that's, and I think that this is the way in which, to define it a bit broadly, is the way through which you can show that Islam, including Arabia in the 7th century is not an unknown territory. It belongs to late antiquity. Arabia Felix, the happy Arabia of the Romans, is a place in which in many ways, although we know very little about it, we know some through epigraphy and so on, we know that there are Christians and there are Jews and there are pagans. And so Arabia is part of this big whirlpool or crucible, if you want, in which Islam is born, and this is a late antique crucible. So that's this now, I think, is accepted by most scholars, although most scholars of late antiquity don't know Arabic, and therefore they tend not to touch early Islam, but this is changing also.
Definitely, with a couple people, scholars, academics that I've interviewed on my channel already seem to have made that transition from classicist studies pertaining to the Roman Empire, its cultures, languages, and religions to what also was going on in Arabia. In your book, you have a very interesting phrase, concept, term. I'll let you describe exactly what it is. But yes, in your book, The Making of Abrahamic Religions in Late Antiquity, you use a very interesting term to describe the milieu in which the Quran began, called Preparatio Quranica. So how do you define that? And is it an original conception? And what inspired you to use that term in the first place?
Okay, I was asked when I came to Oxford, I was asked to give the opening lecture of the International Conference on Patristic Studies, so the study of the Church Fathers. And it was a big honor. It was given from the pulpit of St. Mary Church in Oxford, the university church, and I knew that I'm Jewish, and I knew that most people in the audience would be devoted Christians who study the Christian fathers and so on. And I tried to explicitate what I was doing. I think I called it, I don't remember how I called it, but the patristic crucible uh, of the Abrahamic religions. I think that's how I call it. And I wanted to use concepts that these people use. Now, Eusebius, the church father Eusebius, among his books, he is most famous for his book on the history of the church, ecclesiastical history, but he also has a big book called Preparatio Evangelica. So the preparation of the gospel. And in this, he brings all kinds of quotations, sometimes very long, from pagan authors, Greek and Latin pagan authors, and arguing that actually they were, although they were not Christians, they were pagans, but they were already directing themselves towards the true faith of Jesus Christ. Mm. And I thought I would try to do something similar about late antiquity, Christian late antiquity, patristic literature, bringing ideas and concepts that eventually would be found in the Quran. So I called it Preparatio Quranica, and I'm happy that you picked up the concept. That's what I wanted to say. In previous generations, scholars reading the Quran, finding an idea or a theme or a word that is reminding of the Old Testament, of the New Testament, of Christian or Jewish oral traditions, and so on, will say, well, this is a borrowing of Muhammad from Judaism or Christianity. Today, we don't say, it's not a borrowing. Muhammad and the milieu of the earliest Islam lived in a religious, cultural, and economic late antique milieu. And these stories were circulating in writing and also orally. I mean, we live then in the 7th century in a world which is mainly oral. Mm. There are writings, but mainly people, during the day you walk with your camels, you cross the desert, you sell your stuff from one place to the other, and in the evening you sit down, you lit a fire, and you talk. You sing sometimes, you sleep sometimes, but you also talk to people, and people talk to you. They tell you stories in their language, in your language, more or less. So sometimes you don't quite understand, sometimes they don't quite understand. And so orally, stories are being changed all the time as they are transmitted. So this is creative common knowledge. And this is how one should read the Quran, I think.
And that's something I found really interesting, or what I found really interesting is pagans, or what I believe, or what are called pagans in late antiquity, show reference to the figure of Abraham. And I was wondering, was it through exactly what you described that they came to have common knowledge of a figure so central to Christians and Jewish people? Because I see the Roman Emperor Alexander Severus claimed to possess statues of Abraham, the Roman Emperor Julian, which I believe he really had strong feelings against Christianity. He was said to have reverence for the God of Abraham, even questioning if Christians are true followers of him, why don't they act as he does? So how did pagans in this time gain knowledge of Abraham to where they started seeing him, revering him, and seeing him as a folk hero almost?
Well, again, this is a major question on which I've been starting to do some work, some of it not yet published, but I can give you the gist of it. Well, Abraham is first mentioned in the first chapters of Genesis, Genesis 12 and 17, and God tells Abraham to go from his land in Chaldea to another land that he will give him. In a sense, this is the origin of the concept of divine election, chosenness. God chooses Abraham. Why, we don't know. But chosenness is first a person. God is chosen by God, and God promises him that his offspring will spread throughout the earth and so on. And although they are a small people, they will be a blessing to all the nations of the earth. And these are a few verses or chapters of the Hebrew Bible, which was first translated into Greek in the 3rd century BC. But the stories circulate for many centuries. And therefore, not only among Israelites or Jews, the stories about Abraham are, there's this great man, a kind of culture hero, as others, as Zarathustra and so on. There's this great man, Abraham, who did this and this and this. And so the stories circulate, and we know that now we don't have many traces before Christianity, but in the first Christian centuries, in late antiquity, we know that there are celebrations, yearly celebration near Hebron, where Abraham met the 3 angels. 3 angels of God who appeared to be his guests. He treated them as his guests. The story circulates not only among Jews and Christians, but it's among people from Semitic and what?
I had read that even Arabs would attend this festival. What they meant by Arabs in that time is maybe debatable, and I know we'll talk about this later as we enter the Arabian Peninsula, but I just found that so thought-provoking how maybe the idea of Abraham could have possibly been transplanted into the Arabian Peninsula via maybe only one of the ways, but via maybe this festival that Arabs who lived in maybe in the Arab area who would frequent.
Well, Arabs don't only live in Arabia. In the 4th century, we have Arabs in Palestine. If you want, in a sense, the Nabateans were pre-Arabs. I mean, we can call they were Arabs, but later on, the 4th, 5th, 6th century, people speak Proto-Arabic in Palestine. And they are Arabs, they are Christians, they are pagans, there are no Muslims because there's no Islam, but they are certainly Arabs. And some of these people, and they can come from Transjordan, Jordan of today, I mean, they circulate, they can come from Syria of today, I mean, they come and they participate in pilgrimage, if you want, or festival in honor of Abraham that are done once a year, and everybody joins. And the Jews, the Christians, the Arabs, the pagans, it's a great thing. Everybody goes there. Constantine, who is a serious Christian because he just converted, so he takes it seriously, he doesn't like it. And he decides to establish a church so that this will become a Christian place and not a mixture of people. But so there is, Abraham circulates. Now, in the 5th century, I will give 2 examples, if you permit me. In the 5th century, in the 4th century, you mentioned the Emperor Julian, who says, who is a pagan, of course, he rebelled against the Christianity of his youth, wants to come back to Hellenism or paganism of his ancestors, hates the Christians, writes a book against the Christians, whom he calls the Galileans, because they come from this small place in Galilee. But he says, but I have great respect for the God of Abraham. Although I'm not interested in Jews either. He's more interested in Jews than in Christians, but he's certainly not he's not a Judaizer. The God of Abraham is something else. This is a testimony by somebody who is an emperor who had a very high philosophical education, and we should take what he says and what he writes very seriously. Now, people have not so far. But in the 5th century, there was a philosopher, also Neoplatonist, like Julian. There was a Neoplatonist called Marinus, who became the head of the Neoplatonist school in Athens. Now, this Marinus was born in Nablus of today in Palestine, in North Palestine, which is Nablus takes its name from Neapolis, Flavia Neapolis, the new city, like Naples.
Okay.
And he was born there, and this is, of course, the capital of Samaria. So there are stories that describe him as being a Samaritan, a very old Jewish sect which accepts only the Pentateuch plus Joshua and not the rest of the Bible. So they are not Jews anymore at the time, but it's a religion close to Judaism. And they still exist, by the way. We still have maybe around 1,000 Samaritans.
Okay, wow.
Both in Palestine and in Israel, but no, it's a very small community now. But they still exist, and they still offer a sacrifice of sheep on Passover, and I once saw this festival, and everything is done on a mount called Mount Gerizim, on top of Nablus, just above, southeast of Nablus, and they make this sacrifice. And why there? Because they say that the holy temple of Solomon was not built in Jerusalem, but in Nablus, on Mount Gerizim. That's so. And this Marinus comes from Nablus, was a Samaritan who didn't like the religion of his fathers and became a pagan, became a philosopher, just gave up on the religion of his youth. And there was, on Mount Gerizim, there was a pagan temple built in the 1st century, a pagan temple of Zeus. Instead of the archaeologists have found remnants of all these temples on Mount Gerizim. There was a temple of Zeus, and he offers sacrifices, and he says very good things about Abraham also. So again, we have a pagan, a Samaritan turned pagan, who offers sacrifices and who says very good things about Abraham, and he is called by the Christian theologians of the time, he is called Hanpa, a Hanif, if you want. I mean, the equivalent of Hanif. Now, Hanpa in Syriac means a pagan. A Greek philosopher becomes a Hellen, doesn't believe in the Christian or the Jewish God, he is a pagan. And therefore you call him in Syriac a Hanif, a Hanpa.
Really? Wow.
Now, wait. Now, Hanif in the Qur'an, which is the Arabic version of the same root, Hanif in the Qur'an is of course very good. Abraham is called, or Ibrahim, Hanifan. Ibrahim is called a Hanif.
And it's even in, if you don't mind me just adding that there's even one verse in the Quran, I think it's chapter 10, 105, where it contrasts Hanif to to Mushrik, even at
Yes,
one point.
135, 135. It's Quran 2, Al-Baqarah 2, 135. I mean, it says, Jews and Christians ask you to follow them and you will be well leaded. But I say, kul, say, follow Ibrahim Hanifan, and you will not be a mushrik. That's what the text says. And therefore, the religion for the Quran, the religion of Abraham the Hanif, is the true religion, and it's not Judaism or Christianity. It's a more original religion, the best religion, which is picked up by Islam, by Muhammad, if you want. So Islam. So what is surprising, I'm trying to explain how a bad name like Hanif pagan becomes a good name in the Quran. You understand what I mean? And it becomes good because it's related to Abraham. And it's related to Abraham because for the Christians, Marinus and other philosophers who were pagans were Hanif. For Arabs who heard that these good people are called Hanifs, they understood that Hanif is a good thing.
Yeah,
and therefore they're the true followers of Abraham.
Yeah, and I was going to add that, I had read from a from another academic that I had interviewed, Abdullah Galaduri, that, if you look at the word and what it means etymologically, and in the context of Arab idolaters, the Muslims or monotheists, because I understand that the root of the word means crooked. And I guess within a certain context, you can understand why, say, certain monotheists within a pagan background would be considered crooked, and the same thing that a pagan within a monotheistic background would be considered crooked, hence Hanif.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, sorry, I just wanted to add that. But before, because I have many more questions about the Hunafa, because I mean, there's a lot within Islamic tradition about them. And when you look at where the word came from, as you just mentioned, it definitely is different from the Quran, from how the Quran explains it or describes it. But I'm curious about a certain group. Before we get too far ahead, Jewish Christian communities, just to bring us back a bit. And I know their existence was within a time period that might be considered outside of late antiquity for some, but I do believe their existence and the impression they made throughout late antiquity is one that needs to be discussed. I'm surprised that they've been historically marginalized, but nonetheless, as I mentioned, profoundly affected the history of the Near East and deeply impacted the formation of many religious traditions that would come after. One such group termed Jewish Christians, who according to some are the very foundation upon which early Christianity rests, are the epitome of such marginalization, but whose presence have made an everlasting impression upon the religious milieu, as seen in many expressions of religiosity that would soon follow. So about these Jewish Christians, what exactly do we know about them? Were they a monolith, such as in their beliefs, they shared the same beliefs, or were their beliefs of a variety? Because I have come across a few sects, or if you would even call them sects, looking at the time period that they existed. I've found very few of or at least there's not extreme surety, there's not certainty on what they believed exactly, except for what we know from people who are against them. So if you don't mind just unpacking that for me.
Okay, I think again it's important because I believe that if we're looking for the Islamic origins, we should not avoid or forget the Jewish Christians. I don't want to say that the Jewish Christianity is responsible for Islam.
Mm.
I want to say that this is part of the broad milieu, sectarian milieu, to speak like John once bro, in which Islam was born. Now, Jewish Christians were, the first Christians were all Jews, but very soon most Christians became Gentiles, non-Jews who followed the call of Jesus Christ and Paul, his prophet, if you want. But some people remain, some of the Jews or the offspring of the Jews who had first become Christians remained Christians. And these we call the Jewish Christians. And they had separate patterns of behavior and belief and thought than other Christians. The first Jews who became Christians simply thought that the Messiah had come. The Jews were expecting the Messiah. They believed that Jesus was the Messiah, and therefore, what do you do once the Messiah has come? That's a question that had not been answered or solved within Judaism. So Jesus was the last of the prophets, and he was also the Messiah, basically. He was not yet a divine person that he became in Christianity. Jewish Christians, we know from multiplicity of sources. People disliked them. The Christians thought that they were not orthodox, that they were heretical. After the 2nd century, most Christians are not Jewish Christians, and therefore they don't want to hear about these people who still have a very traditional identity as Jews who believe that Christ means Messiah, that the Messiah has come, or Jews who thought that they were heretical because they thought that the Messiah had come. So neither Christians nor Jews want to hear about them very much. And therefore, they kill them by silence. They try to ignore them. They try not to mention them. Nonetheless, yeah?
I was going to say, even though, yes, I noticed that they were killed by silence. I mean, as I've mentioned, their impression was felt heavily, or at least I see imprints of their thinking heavily throughout late antiquity. I know that there's the Ebionites, the Nestorians, the Ecclesiastites, if I'm saying that correctly. And one such person who came from the Ecclesiastites would be the figure of Mani. And I was actually quite surprised that he came from a Jewish Christian background. And from what a lot of his religion, Manichaeism, a lot of their core tenets, I feel, or just from my little understanding, seems to be pulled from a concoction of maybe the different Jewish Christian groups. I had read, it wasn't from you, and I don't know how true it is, but that Mani, being a Jewish Christian ecclesiite, was inspired by the Ebionite Jewish Christian movement, and went against his own ecclesiite background. And at the same time, he was inspired by Paul, which I see other concepts that we can talk about later that became central to Manichaean belief, which you would see later expressed in the Quran. I hope all of what I said made sense. And if you don't mind, if there's, I mean, was he inspired by Paul, the Ebionites? Why was that was his inspiration of Paul and the Ebionites is the reason he went against his own Christian upbringing? And also, if you don't mind touching on, just because thinking about him going against his own religious upbringing, it reminds me of what you said about Marionite, is it Marcion or another figure?
Marcionites.
Yeah, Marcion, whose founder went against his own religious upbringing. And I wonder, is this a constant theme in late antiquity of people going against what the religion they were brought up upon for searching for what they feel to be a more authentic expression?
Mhm. Okay, let me try to put some order. We're, no, it's extremely complicated. The Ebionites, they are called so by the Christian heresiologists, the Christian fathers, theological writers who write against them. They write against all heresies. Ebionites comes from Evion in Hebrew, Ebion or Ebion, which means poor.
Mm,
Poor in spirit of the Sermon on the Mount is there. The Ebionites were people who claimed that they want to be close to Jesus. Now, these Ebionites are the ultimate Jewish Christians.
mm,
There are many sects, but Jewish Christian sects, but the Ebionites is the most classical Jewish Christian sects. Not the you spoke about the ecclesiae. It is Elkassites.
okay.
The Elkassites again it comes from Elkassai, which means in Hebrew El Ksai, the hidden God,
Mm,
the secret God. These Elkassites were also one kind of Jewish Christians. And Mani was born and grew up in a, in in Mesopotamia, grew up in a group of Elkassites. His father was an Elkassite, and Mani grew up among them and rebelled against them and created a religion which is very different from their religion. But he grew up, we know that, since in the 1960s, an important, very important text was discovered in Egypt, the smallest codex of the ancient world, a book this size, and it is in Greek, a book that tells us the history of Mani himself, of the body of Mani, the history of the body of the prophet. You mentioned also Marcion. Marcion is another major heresite of the mid-second century, early second century in the Christian church. He comes from North Turkey of today, southern the Black Sea, the south of the Black Sea. There's a place there where he comes from. The Marcionites were traditionally seen as being the antipodes of the Jewish Christians. The
mm,
Jewish Christians brought to develop a Christianity that is very Jewish, while the Marcionites wanted to cut all the bridges between Christianity and and Judaism.
mm.
They didn't want to retain the Hebrew Bible, for instance. And even in the New Testament, they made cuts when they thought that Gospels were too Judaized for them to be good. They mainly chose the letters of Paul and not all of these letters. So you have a number of groups of heretics, of Jewish Christians, and they survive for, although the church fathers and the rabbis try to ignore them, we know that they survive for very long. We know through various mentions of their name here and there in different traditions. We cannot enter into the technical discussion now, but up to the 8th century, I believe that they were, perhaps later, they were in the Middle East, in Palestine and elsewhere, groups of people who were Jewish Christians, either Ebionites or something else, and these people had among their beliefs, they believed in docetism. Docetism, from the Greek dokein, to appear, the verb to appear, these docetics claimed that Jesus only appeared to die on the cross, only seemed to die on the cross, dokein, but he didn't really. Really, somebody else was crucified in his stead. So Jesus himself was not crucified. He only it looked as if he had been crucified. But somebody else, a Jew, Simon of Cyrene, who held him bear his cross, had been crucified. Now, this idea that Jesus did not die on the cross comes back also in the Quran.
Mm.
And this is very important, because this is something that probably the author of the Quran got from Docetists were Jewish Christians, from Ebionites, if you want. Now, there is another important pattern of thought among the Docetists, among the Jewish Christians, that can lead to Islam. It is that Jesus is the last prophet, but Jesus is to be seen in a list of prophets since Adam and Eve. There is in history, according to the Jewish Christians, a list of prophets, of good prophets: Adam, Seth, Noah, Abraham, David, up to Jesus, if you want. And there is parallel to this a list of false prophets: Cain, and a list of bad guys that go up to the Antichrist.
And so, in every which, am I correct in understanding that in their conception, before every true prophet, there's going to be the coming of a false prophet
Exactly.
that predates them?
Exactly. The false prophet announced the true prophet. Any false prophet announce is a every false prophet is an antichrist in a sense, and announces a true prophet. And this is something typical only of Jewish Christians, a double chain of prophecy: true prophets versus false prophets. The idea of a pattern of a chain of prophecy can also be found in the Quran, and therefore it seems plausible that there was a Jewish Christian influence there.
Guy, if you don't mind me asking, what could it have maybe been transmitted through some type of Manichaean influence, being that from what I understand of your work, there's a double chain of prophecy in Manichaeanism, but with this double chain of prophecy, there's the biblical prophets, the Jewish prophets from Adam, ending with, in Manichaean conception, ending with Mani. But then there's also another chain of prophets that it might not be linear, but more more encompasses every nation of people, more of a universalist outlook, which mirrors a little bit more of Islam than.
Well, I try to simplify things, and therefore I get into problems. You're right. I must mention now also the Manichaeans. I mean, we've mentioned them. We said that the father of Mani, not his mother, but his father, had been a Jewish Christian of the Elkasite tribe category, and he believed also in a chain of prophecy, true prophets versus, or double chain of prophecy, true prophecy versus false prophecy. And Mani himself, although he rebelled against the faith of his fathers, picked up some of their main ideas. And we know that there were also, we don't know for sure that there were Manichaean traditions and Manichaean communities in Arabia in the 6th and 7th century. But we know that there were connections. They were there. I mean, people have heard about them. And about prophecy, the Manichaeans are very important because, let me try to find where I am. They are very important because they believed the Manichaeans speak about the false prophet and about the seal of prophecy. Now, seal of prophecy is a concept that we know mainly from the Qur'an.
Definitely.
Muhammad is the seal of prophecy, Khatam el-Nabiyyin, the seal of the prophets. And we know that it exists also, the same concept exists in Manichaeism. But in Manichaeism, it doesn't mean the last prophet. The seal of prophecy is what attests to prophecy, what proves prophecy. So the seal of the prophet comes after the last prophet, in a sense, and shows and belongs to prophecy. The seal of a king, when you speak about the seal of the king, it's the seal that attests that this ship or this idea or this goal belongs to the king. Yes, you have a seal.
And I found that to be extremely fascinating, especially if you look at the context in which that verse was in the chapter that it's in. And but also it could lead someone to think that maybe being that the seal of the prophet was relating to the followers of Mani, it makes you wonder if Muhammad was saying that claiming to be seal of the prophet is insinuating that he was a follower of Mani. But that would be, as from what you said, almost impossible, being that we don't have any knowledge of Manichaeism being in the Arabian Peninsula at that time. But I do wonder, being that I understand that you find this concept of seal, maybe not phrased in the same way, but the same term seal found in the New Testament with the writings of Paul, I guess in Corinthians, where it also denotes confirmation, not finality. So I'm still trying to work with this idea of maybe a transmigration of ideas, or a transmigration of Jewish Christian communities into the Arabian Peninsula, that who would later be described as the Hunafa or Hanifs, if you will. And I guess I'm basing that off of Muslim tradition, which have made some interesting, who have said some very interesting things about these people, how they've claimed to search for the original religion of Abraham, how they turned away from certain practices, one being wine drinking. I know with the Ebionites, their forbidding wine drinking was a huge one, as well as other many things that I found similar. And I know that you've been looking into that recently, and I was wondering, have you found any similarities between Jewish Christian communities and maybe who have been described as Hunafa or Hanifs in Muslim literature? Or is that just literary fiction created by Muslims, maybe to describe what could be perceived as monotheistic communities, or pagans going left away from the society in which they were brought?
Well, this is a huge question again. I'm unable to answer it properly. I think that in some ways there are some concepts in early Islam that sound to us to be taken from Manichaean contexts, like seal of prophecy, the seal of the prophet. But of course, seal of prophecy, seal of the prophets happens in earlier texts, as in the Bible. For the seal testifies, and there are also in Manichaeism the Church of Mani became a world church, of course, not only a sect. The Church of Mani is divided between two groups of people. The electi, to use the word in Latin as employed by Augustine, the church father, St. Augustine, who was a Manichaean for 10 years in his life. Uh, Electus is a member of the hardcore, if you want, of Manichaeism. He's a monk. A Manichaean monk is called electus, or electus, a woman. The other people are the people who are around the electee. They are the auditores, the hearers, those who just come to hear lectures, but they don't give the lectures themselves, the auditores. And so you have this very dramatic shaping of the church, of the Manichaean church, which we do not find again in Islam. We find it in Buddhism. In Buddhism, it's like that. The core of the Buddhist church is the Shamga of the monks, those who are only listeners, auditores, are not really part of the church. And we don't have something similar in Manichaeism. We don't have a separation of the, in Islam, I'm sorry, a separation of the Muslims between the true Muslims and the auditores of Muslims, those who listen to Muhammad. But the idea of seal is an idea that I believe Muhammad picked up from Manichaean texts. I think that having said that, I've not said everything, but I've more or less circumambulating, like doing with the Kaaba, from Renan and the idea of the Abrahamic faiths in the 19th century. I described the Near Eastern complex religious milieu in which Islam was born. We spoke about Abraham and his inheritance, the rise of Mani, the Jewish Christians, and Mani himself was born in a Jewish Christian, the Hunafa, and the prophets and Messiah. For the Jewish Christians, the Messiah is a prophet, really. So in a sense, I think that all these concepts are the concepts that become the crucible in which Islam was born. You have to remember two things. A, the crucible of Islam is not only in Arabic. If you are a student of Islam and Arabic and the Qur'an, and you read Arabic, it's very good. You can do it without reading Arabic. But if you don't read the other languages around, you won't understand what this crucible is, because there are no pre-Christian, there are no pre-Islamic Arabic texts. We have only, the Quran is the first Arabic full text that we have. Before that, we have only epigraphy on the rocks in Arabic.
So you have to learn other Near Eastern languages in order to access.
You have to understand the whole milieu, which is a very complex milieu.
And I mean, I'm actually surprised that you were able to give such a synopsis of, as what you said, such a complex milieu. And I really hope from this discussion that the audience goes and do their own investigation, because as you mentioned, There's so much to talk about. You can go up and down in a linear position, or you can move sideways and talk about everything that was going on at a certain particular time and really dig deep on that. But I will ask one last thing about and top it off with the messianic movement or understanding between Jews and Christians. What happened with Muhammad and the Jews of his time? Because it seems like they were a little bit split, or they were a bit on the fence on who Muhammad was based on their previous understanding of Messiah and what was going to happen in certain events that were, as you mentioned, linked to geopolitics, the Sassanids defeating the Romans at one time, and then later the conquest of Muhammad. Do we know exactly what happened, where they departed? Did Muhammad not fulfill certain promises that a Messiah was looking for? Was it because Muhammad didn't call himself a Messiah but called himself a prophet, and the Jews were looking for a Messiah, not a prophet? I still find that to be a very interesting relationship between the two, being that in some theories, early Islam was a Jewish Christian movement. I still find that aspect fascinating.
Well, I will answer very briefly. The short answer is no. We don't know what the Jews thought about Muhammad because we don't have Jewish documents from the 7th century. We have Christian documents, we have other documents, but we have Jewish documents from a little later. So we don't know exactly. But let me try to imagine early 7th century Jerusalem. Until 1614, the city is Christian. The Jews are officially not permitted to live in Jerusalem. They are permitted one day a year, on the day of the anniversary of the destruction of the temple, the 9th of Ab. They come and lament the temple that has been destroyed. Now, that the theory is that they are not permitted. The practice is different. I'm sure there were Jews in Jerusalem, but it's not their city, and they are tolerated by the Christians. You know, the concept of dhimma, ahl dhimma, the tolerated people, the ahl kitab, the people of the book, are tolerated in Islam, provided they pay the jizya and remember always that the true religion is the religion of Muhammad, and therefore they are lesser citizens, but they are citizens, if you want. The truth of the matter is that also this is not a Muslim invention. I think I can find that in Justinian, the 6th century Christian emperor, who does with the Jews, forbids them to read their Bible in Hebrew because we Christians don't understand the Hebrew, and therefore we don't want them to have an advantage on us. But he makes the Jews into an Ahl Dhimma, in a sense. That's very clear. So they are not persecuted, but they are looked under. And in a sense, early Islam adds the Christians to what the Christians had made the Jews. If you want, the concept exists already, is being enlarged to include the Christians and then to include the Zoroastrians and so on. So until the Persians invade Jerusalem in 614 and take the Holy Cross in captivity, which is a big thing for the Christians, the Jews were a reviled minority. Of course, when the Persians come, they are very much in favor of the Persians. When the Persians are routed later on, then they have to pay the price for their betrayal of the Christian king, the Christian emperor. When the Muslims come, again they're uplifted. They're suddenly, I mean, the Muslims come to stay. They don't leave. So Christianity has lost the holy city and has lost the Temple Mount. Now, the Temple Mount, the Haram Sharif of the Muslims, the Temple Mount for the Christians was left unkept, and unkempt was left as a dépotoir of
like a rubbish area,
rubbish area, because the true Jerusalem was the Jerusalem of the Church of the Anastasis, the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, which was higher. And you look, I mean, the ancient Jerusalem had been with the temple in the east side of the city. Now we had the Anastasis on the western side of the city, and on purpose, the Temple Mount was left as a garbage site. The Muslims come and they learn from the Jews that this is where the temple was built, and they decide to build their own temple, a mosque, if you want, on this site. So the Christians that now they, the Muslims, are the leaders and the rulers. They don't destroy the Anastasis, but they want their own building to be higher. So, and at the start, it seems, I can only carefully say it seems, from Islamic traditions that they let the Jews have some kind of wooden structure on the Temple Mount, so they can do their own sacrifices. Then it changes, but at first the Jews are very excited by the coming of the Muslims. And whether they think that Muhammad is a prophet who announces the Messiah or the Messiah himself, we don't know.
They rather take their chances with the unfamiliar than with the familiar Romans of the time.
That's all we can say, and I think it's a proper place to end. It has been my pleasure to be with you, and thank you for asking all these very sharp questions, and my apologies for not being able to answer as sharply as you asked.
Oh no, you know, this has been a phenomenal discussion, and everything that you've said have been very informative. And as I've already mentioned, I hope people go and do research on their own. You have over 150 articles, to 21 plus books and edited editions of different books. So you have a lot for people to investigate in their own time. And thank you for coming on to my platform. I greatly appreciate it. And I really hope that you can, well, you are going to continue in your scholarship. So I can't wait to see what you got next, especially your historiography of the discipline known negatively sometimes as Orientalism. I actually can't wait to hear more about that. So thank you.
It was my pleasure, Terron. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Enjoy the rest of your day. Bye.